All right, everyone, look, I'm just going to come out and say it. I don't like shield perks. Yeah. It's that kind of day. We're getting real edgy today, real edgelord stuff here, talking about shields. The number one thing in the game that I want to like, but don't, are shield perks. I want to talk everything shields today. Disruption Break, Turnabout, Genesis, Shield Disorient. It's not even really in the game anymore, except for like a couple of guns. Even Adaptive Munitions, which seems like blasphemy to say. And in case it's not implied, I'm going to be talking about PvE towards the top end, because that's literally all I do, and because these perks literally don't matter in low tier content whatsoever. Disruption Break used to be the least worst offender of the shield perk world, in that it actually has some good utility. 50% bonus kinetic damage against a target with its shield recently broken. Against anti-barrier champions, this is quite valuable, or it can be, at least. There was a very brief time in Destiny history where people were crazy about Disruption Break, and then it fell off the face of the earth only for it to appear on Arbalest and become a god tier perk on Arbalest, specifically because of how strong Arbalest is with anti-barrier. Disruption Break is a perk that I would like to like more outside of Arbalest, but I just don't, even though it has utility. Now, we have some good kinetic slot weapons that use energy ammo. People love Witherhoard. I'm not a Witherhoard guy, but to each their own. Izanagi is another gun. If you're running one of those two guns, then okay. Disruption Break, not the worst, in a strike with a lot of anti-barrier champions in them, or just maybe even shields. Then you have your generic snipers. Thoughtless is the hot one right now, but Thoughtless is a stasis weapon and therefore does not get the bonus from Disruption Break. It's only non-elemental weapons. And in a world without Arbalest, if you wanted to throw on Disruption Break onto a scout this season, for example, or whatever gun gets anti-barrier next season, and combo it with a 4-stack Izanagi shot on an anti-barrier champion, then go nuts. But we don't live in that world, now do we? Not right now anyway. Regardless, kinetic weapons are mostly primary weapons, and I can count on one finger the amount of primary weapons I want to use on a champion. That weapon is Outbreak Perfected, which is in the kinetic slot, which, if you recall, currently occupied by Arbalest. Legendary snipers like Succession and Thoughtless still feel like they hit like wet noodles against champions, requiring a ton of ammo to put a significant dent into them at the GM level, even with Disruption Break for Succession specifically, which is another reason why Arbalest is nuts. On Master and lower content, Succession with Disruption Break active hits pretty nicely though, I will give it that. And again, killing champions with primary weapons when special and heavy drops are mostly plentiful with the likes of Special Ammo Finisher or seasonal artifact mods that give power ammo or Aeons, it's just not a smart idea. It's something done either out of desperation or in a low intensity environment. There are simply not enough shielded enemies in the game as a whole, which is one of the main problems with shield perks. And in all activities outside of Master or GM content, when there are shields, by the time you destroy the shield, the enemy will be very close to death, or your weapons will deal so much damage that the bonus kinetic damage is sort of pointless. On orange bar enemies, slightly different story with something like Disruption Break. If there's no match game, then, definitely, who cares, right? This is the same reason why Shield Disorient, which disoriented targets hit by a shield break explosion, wasn't really used a whole lot. Not enough shields, and the Disorient never really mattered 99% of the time because the AoE of a shield break would just kill targets outright. Or this perk was on guns that people simply were not using. Other times, enemies are too spread out and nothing meaningful would end up happening. Funnily enough, this perk, I think, would actually be not too bad in GM content on higher health targets, but the perk isn't in the game right now outside of Jotun or Zealot's Reward from Garden, or something that you might have just saved from a long time ago. I have a Disruption Break, Shield Disorient, Zealot's Reward from Garden, and man, I wanted to love this gun so much. The ultimate utility gun, the ultimate void disruption weapon, and I never got to use it because there was just no use for this thing. Until the corrupted GM Nightfall came back in Season 15. It was the perfect storm. Particle deconstruction mod, tons of void shields on weak targets. There was even unstoppable fusion. And guess what? Didn't even use it there because I used Null Composure instead. I had the perfect opportunity to use it, and I didn't. And I legit have no reason other than I was using Null Composure, and that was good enough. Turnabout? Genesis? Am I really going to devote entire perk slots that can be occupied by the likes of Reload perk or Damage perk? Turnabout? Get an overshield on a shield break? In shield-heavy, high-level strikes? Maybe. But considering how quickly an overshield will be peeled off of you anyway in that content, and because I'm going to be playing safe anyway behind my Titan barricade that gives me an overshield, I just don't care. Maybe I'm sleeping on it. I don't feel like I am. You can feel free to convince me. Genesis? Are we really going to try to sell me on Genesis? I mean, more than Turnabout, I'll give you that. If you want me to care about Genesis, you better package it in that 2-for-1 deal you gave Arbalest, because that's the only way I'm going to care about Genesis in most stuff. Foreshadowing. In fact, make it just a 5-for-1 deal. I think that's the only way you could get me to care, is if you combined all 5 of these perks into one single Omega perk. Disruption Break, Shield Disorient, Turnabout, Genesis, Adaptive Munitions. That's the only way I'm putting on a shield perk, is if it does all of that. I'm still not sure I would take it, because it's only going to be effective in very specific parts of, let's say, a GM Nightfall, and much less everywhere else. No, I'm lying. I would 100% take that. But the fact that I need to get to that point in the conversation is a sign that something might be up. But with the release of the master version of Valve the Disciple, this whole video just got flipped on its head, or at least has had its head slightly tilted to the left. Because guess what? Master Val has a lot of shielded enemies. It's not so many that they're annoying to deal with, but it's not so few that they're irrelevant. Destroying those shields is really important for success. This is one of the first times ever where I have felt genuine value out of shield perks, or a perk like Genesis. I use Explosive Personality, the Waveframe Solar GL, with Genesis, and being able to just rapid fire 2 shots against the shielded wraiths to put them in finisher range is actually really nice. And because of how often they're spawning in, I feel the value of something like Genesis, and it feels great. It feels great to have a perk like this have real, genuine value. Could I live without it? Yeah. But does it make sense as a perk here? And is it smart to use? Yeah. The only perk I'm considering otherwise is Adaptive Munitions, which is Bungie's weird way of saying, okay, we know match game limits build crafting, and we agree, so here's a perk that lets you completely get around shields altogether. It's tough for me to care about this perk when Arbalest exists, because Arbalest does this job so much better, but I know that this perk exists so that people don't have to break their builds that Bungie has been pushing people to make. I know it can take out barrier shields, I know, and it's very good at that. There's a scout, it's the new one, Pointed Inquiry, that can 2 or 3 shot barrier shields with adaptive munitions. That's at the sweet spot of scouts actually being very good for anti-barrier shields, because without adaptive, scouts take way too long to kill a barrier shield when Arbalest is here. So in that regard, there is a gun that might actually be as good or better than Arbalest for getting rid of anti-barrier shields. The issue is that Arbalest is still a good choice in the kinetic slot because there are so few weapons that can even compete with how versatile and strong Arbalest is. This is where we talk about Arbalest. Arbalest is the illusion of choice, because Arbalest is so good that, much like Anarchy, it dominates the slot, even with its upcoming nerf. It is oppressively good in that slot. Not only does it have all of the shield break shenanigans going for it, and anti-barrier, and great damage, it's efficient. Champions demand some level of high DPS, but I tend to value high total damage versus high DPS in endgame content like GMs, which makes Arbalest better. I know I said earlier that special ammo is plentiful, but that's for Arbalest, where you're not using as many shots. Other weapons require you to pump out more shots for the same damage that will burn through that ammo really fast. And guess what? Arbalest versus snipers in terms of DPS, they're kind of equal, but Arbalest uses less ammo, and they both hold about the same amount of total ammo, and Arbalest has utility. The difference between using Arbalest versus Thoughtless or Succession is night and day. Its only competition is Witherhoard and Izanagi's Burden, although with Bait and Switch getting a significant buff recently, Witherhoard and Burden do get some bonus points, but that's another topic for another day. Shields themselves probably need to have a full discussion because I don't really know where we're at with shields at this point in the game. They're a D1 mechanic that got carried over, but even in D1, they didn't feel like the most fleshed out thing. Elements exist solely for this one mechanic, or at least they used to. Now there are mods and fragments or whatever else that promote building into using basically all of the same element of everything across your entire character. Ironically enough, these builds can fall apart in endgame content thanks to champion and shield requirements, something that I think will be addressed over the coming year. You could make the argument that in D1, the burn modifiers on Nightfalls with their ridiculous damage increases also gave life to the elemental damage mechanic, but this felt like a tacked on thing more than something with a lot of significant thought behind it. Sorry to the person who came up with that burn modifier if you did put a lot of thought behind it, I guess. Sorry. But on the other hand, if you try to make shields a bigger part of the game, you can end up with the problems we have right now with build crafting in the endgame, where you're forced even more into using only specific elements of weapons just to take down shields. This breaks the all-in on one element build crafting concept that Bungie has been pushing to take the most advantage of the opportunities given to players. Season 16 basically demands that you use nearly all Void everything to take the most advantage of your Void subclass, or at least a Void primary weapon, and Void primary weapons are only in the middle slot. And as we've discussed for the past whatever minutes, Arbalest is basically the only thing worth something in the kinetic slot. And now you've put burns back into the game, which push you towards weapons of the element of the burn, which I generally don't have a huge problem with conceptually or in practice when it comes to difficulty, but I don't know how much it really helps any of these shield conversations that we're having. Now, I'm not a designer, but I just don't know how healthy it is for the game, or at least the shield mechanic, that a gun can not only get around the problem altogether of shields and match game, but is also the best choice for said problem. The same with a perk, which is a new perk. It's not like this perk was in the game since Season 4 and then became relevant. It's new, and it's designed to let players use a gun that maybe matches their element without being penalized, without having their entire build break in endgame because you need arc damage and not Void. This is admirable, but is also perhaps a band-aid fix to a problem that we'll maybe get a look at during the next expansion cycle. It's a very tricky situation. You can't make shields completely irrelevant, but you can't populate the game with them either. Arbalest's nerf specifically was also a band-aid fix to a degree, although I do think that the weapon was simply too strong for its own good in the current landscape of the game, regardless of how any of us feel about shields. While it would be nice to address the root cause of the issue, slapping Arbalest with a nerf is much easier than retooling the entire shield system if you're looking for something quick, and I don't think the nerf was out of line at all. It's still going to be an incredibly good gun, and I also don't want this video to seem like I am advocating for Arbalest to get nerfed into irrelevancy. There are much greater problems at hand than Arbalest itself. That's all I got on shields, shield perks, Arbalest, the whole nine. Let's talk about it. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.